I want to talk today about supply chain security and secure software delivery. And this is a tutorial, so we will be moving into a tutorial section later. But first, I want to kind of explain a bit about supply chain security, what it is, and kind of why it's important. And I think the easiest way to do that is actually by giving you a real example from earlier this year. So I don't know, am I going too far? No, I haven't. I don't know how many of you are aware, but there was an attack on a GitHub action called TG Actions earlier in the year. Or sorry, the GitHub repo was TG Actions, the GitHub action was changed files. So a few of you are probably aware of this, but it was a moderately popular sort of GitHub action, and all it did was track the files that have changed between branches in the GitHub repo. But basically, an update was pushed that meant the action and anybody running the action leaked all the sort of secrets that are available to the runner to logs, which, yeah, wasn't great. And attackers could, of course, then find those logs, secrets in those logs, and exploit them. And this affected like the released version of changed files. So any user of changed files that wasn't pinning to an older version was compromised, basically, and had all the GitHub secrets that were available to that runner leaked. And that wasn't fun, and it affected a lot of organizations. But it didn't last too long, and people fixed it. And I think that's kind of where the story started and stopped for a lot of people. But it's kind of interesting if you dig into some of the details behind the attack and why it happened and how it happened. So the first question you might have is, how was the changed files repo compromised? As you know, the TG Actions folks didn't intend to leak people's secrets. And the answer is, well, actually, one of their dependencies was review dog. And review dog was another action, and it was also compromised. And this compromise was a little bit different. In this case, it was compromised because one of the contributors had leaked a personal access token belonging to one of the contributors had been leaked, and the attackers got hold of that and were able to make updates to the review dog action. There were a few other things about review dog that seemed a little bit not great in retrospect. For example, they actually had automated invite flow. So if you're working on a certain part of the review dog actions, you could actually go through a flow and basically automatically become a contributor, which seems pretty risky. But regardless of how it happened, an attacker did manage to get a personal access token for review dog, and they used that to change the source code so that anybody running review dog, and it did something very similar to what they would later do to change files, as in it grabbed the secrets and it actually saved them into like I think an install.sh file, which they could then later grab and pull anybody's secrets out. And that was the way that they got secrets to change files. So now you have these two actions that have been compromised, and I don't know how many users they had, but the main review dog repo has about 8,500 stars, and change files has another 2,500. So it's probably safe to say that there's hundreds or thousands of affected organizations between these two actions. And looking at that, you kind of would be forgiven for thinking the point of the attack was to get credentials for as many victims as possible, right? So you just monitor for secrets being leaked, you grab them and you try and exploit them before they get rotated. But you'd actually be wrong, because there was not an intent to hack lots of people. There was a single victim that was intended. Yeah, I would take guesses if we are in person. I guess you can put your guess in the chat, or just hold it in your head, because I'm going to tell you now. Coinbase. So the attackers were only after Coinbase. They didn't care about all the hundreds of other people they were attacking. And actually, yeah, I guess they had a plan to make millions in crypto, but it didn't work in the end. I can't remember exactly why, but they were unable to hack Coinbase. But a point I'm trying to make here is to think about this in terms of supply chain. So the attackers didn't go after Coinbase head on, because they knew Coinbase's weakest link wasn't in like Coinbase's infra or their own code. It was probably going to be in one of their dependencies. And that's kind of what supply chain security is all about. And they didn't even go after the change files repo directly. They found the weakest point there was in the review dog repo. And I guess they were right because that hack did work. And they did manage to break change files by breaking compromising review dog. Now, I guess this was a reasonably sophisticated attack, at least insofar as they had multiple hops that were chained together, and there was quite a lot of work to try and sort of hide the leaking of secrets and so on. And the other thing is they didn't care, right? No, they didn't care at all that they compromised all these hundreds or possibly thousands of organizations that between them would have had to spend lots and lots of hours remediating this and rotating secrets. Because even if they didn't make use of those secrets that were leaked, other people, opportunistic hackers, could easily have come along and grabbed them and used them. Anyway, why am I telling you this? So basically, I'm hoping that this one incident, which you might not even have heard of, convinces you of how important supply chain security is. So these days, it's essential to look not just at the security of your own infrastructure and your own code, but also look at security or like look at where the software you're using, where does it come from? How do you verify where it's come from? What is its provenance? And how do you keep it updated so it's not vulnerable? Before I move on, I should say most of my details on these attacks came from the Wiz blog. So if you go and look at the Wiz blog, you can get a lot more details and stuff on exactly how these attacks occurred. So I thoroughly recommend that if you want to do some more reading. Okay, so moving on to who we are and what we're going to do. My name's Adrian Mouat. I'm DevRel at ChainGuard. If you want to get in touch with me, that's my email. You can also find me on Blue Sky and LinkedIn, etc. I'm usually fairly easy to find because my surname is relatively unusual because for some reason it has three vowels in a row. So it's Mouat. And yeah, you'll be able to find me most places. But with me, I'm going to do a presentation, but afterwards, Tom is going to take you through a demo. So I'll let Tom introduce himself.
Yeah, hello everyone. Hopefully, I met some of you yesterday because I was actually at Platform Con in London, which is why I threw that picture in because I thought it fitted in quite nicely. But I'm part of the sales engineering team here at ChainGuard, and like Adrian said, I'm going to do a bit of a demo, bit of a walkthrough, so there will be some hands-on. So hopefully, it should be quite interesting.
Cool. Okay. Agenda. Yeah. So basically, what I'm going to start by talking through a few things, talk a little bit more about supply chain security, what it is and what can kind of go wrong, and also how you can start thinking about preventing attacks and improving your supply chain security. And then we'll talk about salsa, SigStar, and chips. Then we'll have Tom's demo, and I'm hoping we'll have a good amount of time for questions. This is the first time we've run this tutorial, so I'm very keen to find out what people find interesting and what they would like us to talk more about and things like that. Okay, so I'll move on to supply chain attacks. So why are we seeing more and more supply chain attacks? I think I've kind of talked about this a little bit already. Um, But I would say, and this is partly speculation, but it's a mix of opportunism and improved enterprise security. So in general, and it's definitely not a given, but I think a lot of large enterprises who attackers tend to target, have reasonable security in sort of cybersecurity terms. Now, banks, enterprises, they're not perfect, but they do think about this stuff, and they also tend to employ specialists to take care of the stuff. But the people that are much less resources to do these are like your small projects, like the XKCD cartoon. So I got my XKCD reference out early. Every presentation has to have one, apparently. Um, but yeah, it's the small projects that are sort of highlighted by this XKCD cartoon that may not have as good supply chain security. And so attackers can sometimes, break a high value target by managing to compromise one of those. Or alternatively, it can be a simple numbers game. If I can compromise one target and that dependency is used by tens or thousands of other organizations, I can potentially compromise a whole bunch more people depending on what my goals are. Okay. So there are a lot of different places that supply chain attacks can occur. So this screenshot is from the Salsa project. I'll talk a little bit more about Salsa, which is software, what's it, supply chain levels for software artifacts. It's got a slightly convoluted name just so they could have Salsa. Um, this screenshot is from Salsa, and they identify different stages where supply chain attacks can occur. So I'll kind of walk through them briefly. I don't suppose you can't see my mouse pointer, can you? No. So A is like the malicious supplier. So like at this point A on the far left where it says producer, having an attack there would be where the actual producer of the software is malicious, right? They've created something that's intended to hurt you or break your systems or compromise you or whatever. Or they've made malware and are trying to hide it in some way. B is kind of arguably where review dog and changed files sit. So it says that's authoring and reviewing down there. So theoretically, you maybe could have caught the review dog or change files attacks by having stronger sort of levels of reviews or controls in actual making changes to GitHub. C is at the source level, so that's when an attacker can sort of subvert like your version control, sort of Git or whatever itself. So they can be putting stuff in there without your knowledge, without going through the expected systems. Uh, D, I think that was external build parameters. I think not too convinced by that one. E, though, is the build process itself. And so that's an extremely important one. And this, you've probably heard of like the SolarWinds, which is a very famous attack, and probably was one of the main inspirations for the creation of projects like Salsa. And that was where the actual build system was subverted. So the actual machines that the builds were running on were compromised. And that allowed them to compromise the builds that were happening and the software that was getting included into the actual built artifacts without the people that create the software realizing and without adding anything to source control. F and G are pretty interesting. So that's at the sort of level of subverting things after the build. So we've built the artifact, it's the correct artifact, but somewhere after that, it's being changed or modified. So that the actual software that the user downloads is not what you think it is, right? So for example, an attacker might get into the download site for something and just swap out the binary. H, what's it called? Package selection. I think that's largely about things like typo squatting. So like, you think your Java application is using a package when you've actually typoed it and you've got a malicious package in there, for example. I would kind of argue that's also very similar to A as well, where you've got a malicious producer. You just used it by accident. I is apparently usage. I'm kind of a bit dubious if that's really a supply chain attack. Apparently, it covers things like, having bad defaults. So, for example, like web servers running with a default username and password, things like that. But the big thing is, you'll notice there's a bit of a circle or cycle in the middle of this diagram. So the biggest issue with supply chain security is that your dependencies have dependencies, and those dependencies have dependencies on and on and on. And so there's just huge scope for somebody to find a problem at one of these levels. Like the scope is enormous, quite frankly. Okay, so hopefully you're kind of sufficiently scared now. What can you do to prevent the sort of attacks that I've talked through there? I'm going to talk about three projects in particular, and I like these three projects because I think they all offer sort of practical advice that you can act on and will result in sort of improved security and defend against several of these attacks. So the first one is Salsa. We've already mentioned Salsa. But Salsa is supply level, what is it? Supply chain levels for software artifacts. Yeah, say that's 3 times fast. And it focuses at the minute on build systems. So it defines multiple tracks, but at the minute, there's only really the build track. There is another source level track that's currently in RC, but at the minute, it focuses on the build level track. So it's really about your build systems. And then it defines three levels. Um, so level one here is all about just starting to create provenance and documentation about your build systems. So you'll have a CI/CD system, you have it written down, and you'll have some documentation of what it does, and it will be producing some level of provenance, as in attestations, things like that. Then at level two, you're getting a little bit more complex. You add in signing, um, and you also have this idea of a hosted build platform. So you're not running your builds on somebody's laptop. They're being run on dedicated hardware that's designed for the job and can be sort of secured, and it can be verified that it ran on that hardware, that kind of thing. And then level three is taking this hardened build platform even further and making sure that nobody can tamper with it, and you'll get sort of greater levels of isolation. This slide's really sort of the same information in a slightly different view, so you can sort of see the differences between the levels. So you get adding sort of further signing and levels of isolation as you move up the levels. But it is relatively difficult to get to level three, for example. But this sort of provenance ties very strongly in with a project called Sigstore. Yeah, so a key part of provenance is signing. And signing basically lets us prove who produced a given artifact. Okay? So like it's how we can say things like, this operating system came from Microsoft, or this container image is a Docker official image, or this container image is a chain guard image, and be able to actually prove it and verify without doubt that that is the author of that thing. But you can also sign attestations and stuff. So you can start to say things like, hey, I can prove this software was built on this hardened build instance here. And that's how you sort of start to build your provenance and preventing attacks or certain levels of attack. Okay, so Sigstore is a sign solution, but it's pretty complex. You can go and look at the Sigstore dev site, and it's a lot of interesting documentation there. But a lot of the complexity is on the server side, if you like, and you don't need to worry about it as a user. And one of the really, really, really nice things that I love is called keyless signing. So previously, if you wanted to sign something, you would have to generate a private key, and lots of you have probably done this, right? You've created a private public key pair, and you've used to sign something, and you've got to keep that private key. Well, you've got to keep it for starters, but you've also got to keep it secret, not leak it, not lose it, etc. And it's a pain because that's kind of hard to do securely. Now, Sigstore supports keyless signing. Now, I keep saying keyless, but it's kind of keyless in the same sense that serverless is serverless. There's servers involved and there's keys involved. It's just they're kind of hidden from you. So in Sigstore keyless sign, what happens is it creates a temporary key based on an OIDC identity that you give it. So what you end up being able to say is that this artifact was signed by someone who controlled this OIDC identity at this exact moment in time. But yeah, the amazing thing is you no longer need to look after a private key, and it means things are pretty simple, and it's not really any excuse for not signing stuff. And just to sort of drive this point home, I've got an example here. If you do want to see the full example or the full GitHub action, you can use this QR code. URL got a bit long, so I didn't put it on the slide. But that QR code should, I hope, take you to I'll take you to a project well, I think I'll take you to this actual action, but it's part of a project that just tries to be sort of best practices for GitHub builds, GitHub action builds. And this step here is the actual sign step. And really, the first bits are just gathering metadata, gathering names of images, and then this cosign sign is doing the actual signing of the container images. And cosign is part of the Sigstore project. Now, there's a few things here. First thing to know is it uses the GitHub token. So I never create a private key. I don't really do any setup. The only thing I have to do is make sure the action has access to the GitHub token. And then and obviously that cosign's installed, and then you can run this. And so it's very simple. There's not very much setup at all. And there's definitely no creating a private key. The other thing to point out is that this sign command will actually upload the signature to the same place that the um, images are by default. So it'll upload it like, if you're pushing to the Docker Hub, it'll upload the signatures to there. If you upload them to a different registry, it'll by default upload them to there as well. Um, and that's really nice because you don't have to spin up separate infrastructure to store your signatures. If anybody remembers like Notary from V1 from the old Docker days, that was a bit of a pain because you had to have separate infrastructure to store all your signatures and things. In this case, it just gets stored alongside the images. So again, really easy to use, and there's not any excuses not to be doing it nowadays. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about is container hardening priorities. So this is a project that I worked on, and basically it just provides a set of criteria for assessing the security of container images. And you can go, it's on GitHub. Um, you can go and find the project by just scanning that QR code, but it's basically at github.com chips-dev/chips. The name is meant to be sort of, make it clear that's a kind of a sister to salsa in some ways. So chips and salsa. Although admittedly we're in the UK, so chips generally means, I want to say French fries. Although it seems wrong saying French fries for chips. Anyway, um, yeah, I think the easiest thing to describe chips is actually to look at what's basically the standard here. So these are all the criteria within chips. One thing I should say is there is a scorer for this. So you can automatically run some of these criteria against your own container images. But basically there's multiple criteria. The first one is minimalism. So here's looking at things like having a minimal base image. Um, and you can start thinking about things like remove and build a debug tooling, removing shells, removing package managers as you get more complicated. But minimalism is actually really useful in terms of supply chain security, because the more things we cut out, less dependencies we have, then, frankly, the better your supply chain security gets because the smaller your supply chain is. Provenance, kind of talked about that a lot already. So we are getting to things like Sigstore there, but we're also saying things like, hey, make sure like your base images, make sure you're getting them from like a Docker official image or a chain guard or somewhere, and you're not using a 2-year-old image from like a user's repository, for example. Make sure you're verifying anything you download into your own build steps. Try pinning images to digest and pinning packages. I do mention SBOMs here. I don't really have time to go through what SBOMs or software bill of materials is in this presentation, but it tends to be very important and talked about a lot in supply chain security. Reproducibility, that's another thing I could do a whole separate presentation on. It's basically the idea that if I run a build twice, I should get a binary exact thing out, exactly the same thing out. But typically, that's not the case, believe it or not, because builds tend to have things like timestamps and build IDs, and that doesn't happen. But if you have full reproducibility, it does have some nice knock-on effects for supply chain security. Then there's a whole bunch of configuration stuff. So just making sure like no secrets are leaked. That is a thing that happens, unfortunately. Making sure your process doesn't run as root. And then one I want to talk about a little bit more is vulnerabilities. So here, like, we're saying, hey, make sure that your image runs with no critical vulnerabilities, and then getting all the way down to like running with no vulnerabilities. And you will notice that's at one of the hardest levels, because it does tend to be hard to remove all known vulnerabilities from an image. Yeah, so I'm talking about CVEs here. I don't know how many of you here use tools like Privy, Gripe, or Sneak. There's a bunch more as well. Basically, you can run these tools on your software or your container images, and they will tell you if there's any known vulnerabilities in them. And what they do is they use databases like NVD, which is a database of known vulnerabilities in software. They create a database of all this known vulnerabilities and compare it to software that's installed in your image or VM or whatever, and alert on any matches. And that all sounds good because by default, you would think, well, hey, I'll run these tools, and if it finds any matches, I won't deploy it to production, we'll fix them. But what you actually find in reality, and I'm sure some of you have tried this and found this, is that you do get matches and you get a lot of matches in some cases, even for like published base images on the Docker Hub. So you're starting from this place where your software or your container image already has all these vulnerabilities. And it's kind of like, well, what do you do now? Right? I can't fix these because they're in the base image. And I don't want to deploy it to production. And you're kind of like in a no-win situation. And actually, my answer is pretty much, I wonder if I can go back. Um, it's sort of twofold. One, minimalism, right? Try and cut out as much as possible. The more you can get your images, the base image, especially smaller, the closer you'll be able to get to zero CVEs. And then the second bit is use something, and I'm going to say like ChainGuard, where um, we do sort of more work towards remediating CVEs and trying to give you a zero CVE base or application image. And on that point, I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to take you through a demo of some of the stuff that I've talked about, especially with regards to vulnerabilities and so on. I think this is actually the right link as well. So, like, if anybody wants to follow along, I think that's the right link, but I'm sure Tom will take over and show you as well.
Yeah, I will drop that link into the chat. And I'm also going to pop another link into there as well. Um, and then I'll share my screen and I'll start talking it through. Um,
Well, one, do I need to stop and ask, is there any questions in the chat, or do we need to pause for a second or anything?
there was one question specifically around loads of vulnerabilities in open source software and like what I mean, it was specific around going back to the organization. So that was from Brian, but I think we'll cover quite a lot of that in the next section. And if there's more questions off the back of it, amazing. We can have those thrown into us and we can go from there.
Okay, perfect.
Right, let me get my screen sharing and I can talk a little bit about what we're going to do. So I've dropped let me just get rid of Zoom so it's not in my way. Oh, that'll do. Always gets in my way. So I've dropped this link into the chat. So if you want to follow along, and you don't have to follow along if you just want to watch, that's absolutely fine. But a lot of what we're doing, you'll be able to do in real time. So follow this link, and within here, we've got additional resources. But the thing that you'll want to jump into is this demo section. Because essentially in this demo section, we're going to be walking through migrating a Python application from the standard Python image that you would just pull down to a ChainGuard image. So this is going to be the hands-on bit. Um, so little bit of prereqs. I think these were sent out. So if you've got this stuff already, amazing, but it won't be too much of a challenge to get it up and running if you want to follow along. So if you've got some kind of system that has a terminal, I'm going to assume 99% of people here do, most likely 100%. But if you're on Mac or you're running Linux or you've got a subsystem for Linux on Windows, that's great. That'll get you 50% of the way there. There's a question. Oh, we might have to get to that bit at the end. So if you've got Docker, great. If you don't have Docker, the links here will get that up and running for you fairly quickly. And we're also going to use one of those scanners that Adrian just mentioned, the Gripe scanner. If you've got Trivy, that's fine. You can use Trivy. If you've got another scanner that you use, maybe a Twistlock, a Wiz, a Sneak, an Orca, who knows what, feel free to give that a go as well, because the whole beauty of this is the ecosystem is very integrated, but Gripe's typically very noisy and it's a nice thing to use because it gives us a lot of data. So if you don't have that already on your system, we've got the curl command here that you can just pull that down and get going. So um, I'll let people start to pull that down as I start to give a bit of an overview of some stuff. And then when we get to the hands-on piece, hopefully everyone's up and running. If you're not, you've got any problems, drop it in the chat, come off mute. I think we've got about 50 people on, so we can probably handle some questions being thrown. But we'll get onto that in a little bit. So I've also popped this URL into the chat because you'll be able to follow along as I go through the Chain Guard console. So the beauty of it is you can follow this link. You don't have to sign up. You can just see everything that I'm doing in real time as we go. But I'll give this a little bit of a talk through and an overview and a demonstration, and then we'll get hands on. So, oh, there's another chat. Oh, cool. Adrian's picking up one of the. I'm going to leave the chat for now, otherwise, I'm going to keep popping in there and out of there. So, if you've got a burning question that you need me to answer straight away or a problem, come off mute and shout at me. So, if we head on over to images.chainguard.dev, this will take you through to the ChainGuard console. And within here, we have loads and loads and loads of images that are available that are essentially open source projects that we are rebuilding every day on our OS. So Wolfie or ChainGuard OS, as it's more commonly known now, which is very minimal OS. So kind of following those principles that Adrian was talking about earlier on. And the ultimate goal of all of this is to provide you with very minimal CVE-free or as near as CVE-free container images as possible, all with full SBOMs, provenance, and attestation. And we'll talk through all of that and you'll get to have a look into it. But that's ultimately the outcome of all of this. So all built within our hardened environment, the factory, which follows that Salsa framework that Adrian was following, that was talking through earlier on. And as of today, there are over 1,400 there available, and this is being added to all the time. So if there's an open source project out there that is still being contributed to, and it's not just something that's been left on the back shelf that's getting dusty, then it's something we can always look at adding, and that's kind of how this image repository gets larger and larger and larger. So we cover the base images, and we'll be using a base image today. We'll be using Python. We cover application images, so your Postgres, your Nginx, your Grafanas, your cert managers, all those good things sit within the application images. We've got AI images, and we've also got these starter images. So if you have a bit of fun today and you think, you know what, this would be great for me to start playing around within my environment, we've got a number of these starter images available. So 37 in total. You get access to latest. Again, you're not having to buy anything, sign up. You can just get access to them, use them, and see what that looks like in your environment. So a little bit about what's going on in the console. So what we're going to do today is focus on Python because everyone uses it, right? It's absolutely everywhere. So follow along or watch me, either or. But within the ChainGuard console, we can look for that Python image, and this is the first thing you'll see. All of the different versions that we have available in here. And it goes way far back, right? All the way to stuff that's end of life or going to be end of life. Not every single version of all time is going to be there, but a hell of a lot of things are within there. And we're monitoring all of these all the time. The same process is occurring. A new release gets cut. We are putting that down, rebuilding, and providing you that end result, which is the chain guard image. So you'll see here that some of them have dev next to them, some of them don't. So when we talk about those minimal images, those minimal container images, we strip a lot of it out, and that's great. But sometimes when you're iterating in development, there are some things you need there to debug and so on. So the dev instances of this have um, a couple more tools within them. So, for example, if we look at the specifications within here, you can see that actually, like this latest production that we're using, it doesn't have package manager, it doesn't have shell. But if we were to switch this to one of the dev versions, you'll see that it does. So we put a couple of extra things on there so you can start debugging and doing your thing. So going back to, I'm just going to pop it back to tags for now. There are a couple of things to talk about here. A couple of things that are really important about what Adrian's been talking about. So first off is if we look at a comparison, let's take latest because that's what we're going to be using today. Within the console, you'll see some really interesting stuff, right? If you're just going and putting an alternative and, we can pick different alternatives here. So if you're using Alpine or you're using something else, you can look at those comparisons as well if you go onto the console. But we can see here, Python latest has a whole load of vulnerabilities in it. And these are super painful, right? Because a lot of these are things that you just really can't do anything about because it all goes back to like the underlying base, super painful. And you can also see that it's pretty bloated, pretty large. It contains a lot of stuff it ultimately doesn't need, which doesn't fit with the principles that Adrian was talking about earlier on. Whereas when you look at ours, it's far, far smaller, and there's one CVE in there at the moment. Now, this is real life, right? This is happening daily. So usually we would expect this to be zero, but vulnerabilities do pop up, right? And you can see here as these images accumulate over time versus the alternative, you can see there are peaks and things appear and then they get fixed and they go away. But if we drop into the vulnerabilities section, you can see exactly what that is. So within here, we get information around the severity, we get a little bit of a description around what it's impacting. And if we go to the advisories, we can see all of the advisories that have been coming through and when they've been fixed. Sometimes they don't affect anything because it just simply doesn't exist. And you can jump into these and then start learning more about it. So going through to NVD and you can see exactly what it is. But typically we get these sorted pretty quickly. There's an SLA around all of this. So critical and high, 7 days. Usually it's a lot quicker than that. We often find that they're fixed before the scanners are picking them up. So there's fun and games to be had there. But that's kind of where we're at the moment. So you'll see all of this when we do the hands-on walkthrough. But the other thing to think about, and I'm just going to touch on it for now because we'll actually go through and run all of this and you'll get to do it hands-on and see what it's all about, but is the provenance piece. So, understanding um, where this has come from and proving where it's come from, and then looking at the environment that it's been built in. So we'll be able to pull down all the attestations around that environment, and we'll also be able to run our verification against that as well. So we'll be walking through all of this. So that is part of the reason I said make sure you're on this URL as well, because when it comes to the provenance piece, you'll just be able to pick up the starter images commands and we'll be able to run our verification. If you do want to pull down specific attestations, then we can do that. So it'll just make your life easier because it becomes a copy and paste exercise. So if there are questions, hopefully they're in the chat. If you need to shout at me, shout at me. But I'm hoping by this point in time, everyone is up to speed, has everything they need to get going, and it can be less of Tom talking and more of us all doing. And I'm seeing lots of questions, but I'm going to ignore them and hope that they're all being addressed as we go. So, there are no hard and fast rules for this. You don't have to use the same editor. If you want to use VS Code, you want to use Vi, like it doesn't matter. You do you. I'm not going to use Nano, but it's there if you just want to do a copy and paste and go full autonomous. But you do what's most suitable for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up our terminal. If you don't want to use a terminal, you can probably get away with it, but life will be easier if you do. And we're just going to go and create this little Python hello world app. It's going to be super simple. It's a command line based app that's going to print something out. So it's not going to set your world on fire, unfortunately, guys. But we're going to pick something fairly straightforward or very straightforward today, just because there's a few of us on here and we don't want to overcomplicate it. So what we're going to do is head on over into our terminals or whatever you might be using. Hopefully this is big enough. I have zoomed in a little bit, but it should all be okay. We're going to go ahead and make that directory and move along into it. So once we're there, we're going to go and create a little Python script, and we're going to enter this Python code to just go and print out hello Linky with a little tiny octopus. And you're probably thinking, why on earth do they want me to create something that prints Hello Linky with an octopus? There is a story there. The OS that we built from the ground up, Wolfie, it's based on the smallest octopus known, obviously that minimal piece. And we have a lovely mascot called Linky. You probably can't see behind me, but I've got a fluffy one there, hence the octopus. So we're not crazy. There is a reason that we're asking you to do that. So just a little bit of context around what we're building. So let's go and get that file created. So I'm going to just go, what are we calling this? I can't even remember now. Just hello. And I don't have the ability to talk and type at the same time, unfortunately. So I'm going to pop this in, save it out, and let's just make sure it's all okay. Cool. Yeah, it's there. So we've got our script built out, really straightforward. Oh, that's interesting. I've gone into edit, one sec. There we go. So next thing we're going to do is create a Docker file. So really straightforward. Going to create a Docker file and we're going to pull from Python. We're going to make sure that that Python script's pulled over, drop our entry point in, and we're going to be good to go. And then we're going to build this out, run it, and we're going to see the end result. So again, lots of you probably know how to do this. Do this on a day-to-day basis with far more complex things, but keeping it simple allows us to all follow on and we can run some scans and you can see some interesting stuff. So let's get that Docker file created. So, and drop that in and we're good to go. So should all be created. Now what we're going to go and do is build the image from that Docker file. So very straightforward. We're going to give it a name that you've probably created many times with lots of workshops and tutorials, but we're going to go and create this Python hello image. So let's drop that in, run it, and we should be good to go. So let's just clear that out so it's not messy. And now what we're going to do is run that image. So copy that code. And hey presto, we've got this very, very amazing Python application running in our Docker container with Hello Linky and the little octopus printed out. So there we go. We've got something running. Treat that as our Python application that we're using in our organization today. Now, what we want to do now is look at the security of this. How many vulnerabilities sit within this particular container? So we're going to use Gripe. Some of you may have used Gripe before. Maybe it's totally new to you. You might use other vulnerability scanners, so Trivy, Sneak, maybe one of the CNAP organizations like Wiz. You might be using one of those. But we're going to pick up Gripe, and we like to use Gripe internally because it's notoriously quite noisy. But that's great because when it comes to really stripping everything down with what we do, it allows us to ultimately guarantee, well, not guarantee, but get as close to zero CVs as we possibly can. So you'll actually see it in a little bit when I demonstrate this with a couple of different scanners. Sometimes we get results, sometimes we don't, because some of them are a little bit noisier than others. So what we're going to do is we're going to run gripe against this Python hello container that we're running. So let's go ahead and run that, and it'll load its DB, it'll parse the image. It will give us a load of output, and what you're going to have to do is do a bit of scrolling in a bit to get past all of the noise and get to the overview. So as we can see here, there's quite a lot going on, right? And this is not uncommon. I've worked for a scanning vendor in the past, and this was my life, seeing lots and lots of vulnerabilities appearing. But if you scroll up past all of this noise, you'll actually get to the top here. So when we look at the scan for vulnerabilities, we'll see the number of vulnerabilities that have been found, and then more importantly, by severity, right? So we've got 8 critical here, nearly 120 high. We've got mediums, lows, and negligible unknowns. And some of these are fixable, some of them are non-fixable, and so on. But as it stands at the moment, when we go back to what Adrian was talking about earlier on, this is not what we want. And this is really common. You'll see lots of these vulnerabilities occurring in lots and lots of software that you're using today. So as the tutorial states, and I'm not going to read the tutorial out to you, but like the most alarming thing is this kind of critical 9 to 10 vulnerabilities that have been found. When I say 9 to 10, I mean like graded 9 to 10. So what we can actually do here is we can tidy this output up a little bit to just focus on those critical vulnerabilities. So just grabbing that same command and just limiting it to our criticals. So you'll be able to pull the command from within the tutorial. So runs through, does its thing, and now we see everything here and we see exactly where they're coming from. So this will change on a day-to-day basis. So, the tutorial that we're following today was not written today. It was written a couple of months ago. So the number on the day might be different. It all depends. Sometimes things get fixed, sometimes they don't get fixed. But you'll notice here that all of these sit on won't fix. So we're kind of in a tricky position here that like they're just sat there and there's not an awful lot we can do. So this is where you kind of need to go and do that like uh, risk assessment process to see like is it even relevant? Is it being used? Like do we need to go and manually mitigate it, which is hugely painful. Being at PlatformCon yesterday, a lot of people are saying this is not really what they want to be doing with their day to day, but unfortunately, they're having to. So getting all that fixed can be quite painful. So what do we want to do about it? So we looked at these Python this Python image within the ChainGuard console. What we're going to do is migrate it, and migration in this particular scenario is really straightforward because all we need to do is edit the Docker file. And rather than just pull that alternative image, we're going to go and pull the ChainGuard Python image. So ChainGuard Python image being this one up here. And we're just pulling the latest, right? I know not everyone sits on the bleeding edge. Realistically, you would be, pinning it to a tag. But just for fun and games, we're going to pull latest today because it makes life far easier. So we're going to go and edit that file, and we're going to replace that line with the Python image from ChainGuard. So let's go and do that. If we just go to our Docker file again, edit that, we're going to go and edit out and pop in a ChainGuard image. So super straightforward, just like a drop-in replacement, right? And in a base image world, that will vary depending on how complicated your app is, because obviously if things are missing that need to be added, there is stuff that we're going to have to do. With the application images, so if you do after this think, you know what, that was really cool, maybe I'll pick up an application image and see how that works in my world. It's just adding your config and it really is just a drop in. So really straightforward, but we're using Python today because it kind of is relevant to most people. So anyway, we've made that change. What we're going to do now is go through the same process again, build out that new image and give it a even more wonderful name of ChainGuard Hello. So let's copy that out, clear this because I just don't like noise, and go and run a build. Obviously, I've done this before, so it's fairly quick for me, so it might take a couple of seconds for you. And now what we're going to do is get it up and running. So get it up and running. And lo and behold, our app still seems to work. It's still doing the same thing. It's behaving in the same way. Nothing's fundamentally wrong here. So we seem to be in a good position from I'm going to say business perspective. I mean, I don't think people are really running their businesses on these kind of apps, but you get where I'm going with it. So everything looks good. So what we're now going to do is run a gripe scan against this particular, whether this ChainGuard alternative, right? So let's drop that in, run our scan, and here we go. One CVE. So we were expecting that, right? Because when we looked at the console earlier on, we saw there was that particular CVE that was flagged on the console. So that's being brought back, and hopefully in 1, 2, 3 days, that's no longer going to be there because we're constantly monitoring the upstream, or not the open source projects even, and then we're running our rebuilds. So hopefully that won't be there anytime soon. But it reflects exactly what you saw in the console. We've not got, I can't even remember how many we had before. We have this one medium severity issue, and obviously it's far smaller than the other option. Now, the other thing we could do here is we could say, actually, I'm going to go and run a Trivy scan against it. So, I can't remember what it is now. I think it's Trivy. shows you how often I use it. There we go. So running it through, and actually here it's not pulling anything back. Um, and this in its own right brings an interesting kind of conversation, particularly around when you're looking at this vulnerability management piece, because I'll often speak to people that might use Alpine, like Alpine Slim, and they might use Trivy, and they're saying it looks great. I've got no vulnerabilities, but you pop gripe in, and it does pull vulnerabilities back. Now, noise isn't always great, but um, it just shows that sometimes, depending on the scanner you're using, um, will vary. Will give you varied results, which is kind of why we don't have a scanner, right? We don't want to mark our own homework. We want people to be able to use the scanner that they're using, but ultimately, we we want to remediate all vulnerabilities that will be picked up by any scanner, hence use the noisiest one, and we're good to go. But thought it was worth showing that one, we can be scanned with multiple different scanning tools because not everyone uses Gripe, but also there can also be discrepancies with what's actually being pulled back. Um, so that kind of takes us through that part of what we wanted to show today. But the story doesn't really end there with what we're doing with these images, because it's not just the vulnerabilities you need to care about. They're a huge pain and they cause a lot of people a lot of headaches. But there are other things we need to think about, right? So we need to start thinking about, like, what do these even contain? So I saw somebody saying they love S-bombs in the chat earlier on. So you can pull those S-bombs from the console if you want to, and you can pull them down. But there are other ways of grabbing them too, but they're available within here. But the other thing to think about is provenance, right? So being able to verify these. So these are coming from ChainGuard. But you want to make sure they really are coming from ChainGuard, right? So when we look here at verifying these Python images, you can see you can actually pick up this starter images cosine verify. So we can double check, and you can all do this if you've got access to the console. But we can go and run this and make sure it really is what we said it is, right? It genuinely is coming from us. So um, you know, there are instances where things can be changed and you end up not having what you originally thought. So we're able to provide that for you. So, okay, we're happy that it's got the right signing. But then when we look at the attestation piece, you're actually able to pull things down. Like you can pull down the SPDX of the full SBOM. You can um, pull full attestation around the build environment. So I won't do this right now because it depends on what you want to see. But again, starter images, you can go ahead and pull any of these three things. All you need to go is go and change this URL. But again, you can pull all the information around that build environment, all the information around that. You can pull down that full software bill of materials, but also being able to verify that attestation as well. So being able to verify the system that it's come from as well. So similar to what we were doing before, you can just copy that through, run that, and again, it's going to come through and we get that full verification around, yeah, that is what we were expecting it to be. So with these images, you're not just getting a much, much smaller version of something you're using today. You're getting something that accumulates CVEs far slower, has a much smaller amount of CVEs in, but then you have that full provenance and attestation around where it's coming from. It's not just about it having no vulnerabilities. It's about you being able to trust where it's coming from, the environment it's being built in, and not just putting it from God knows where. Because open source is a great thing. We rely on it very heavily in what we do today, but it can come with a lot of challenges. It can come with like those bloated vulnerabilities, software supply chain attacks, like Adrian was saying. So that's exactly what we're really trying to do here, just kind of help people tame the chain as the session's named, and really help them to get into a more secure state.